Ship refits, something that just about every warship and most merchants will have to go through at multiple points. Unless you've got a particularly short-lived example, though even then, post-trials refits are a thing. If you're wondering why this video is familiar, this is another reprise of an older video. I found the old history short stories videos could do with a retake, and this is another example of that. That aside, the topic of refits can take many forms. There are, of course, the more generic refits, the kind where a ship goes into dry dock for a bit to fix up wear and tear, or alternatively, modify something that is proven to be defective in service. This is the kind of refit that every ship has to do at some point, large or small. After this, you move to the more extensive overhauls. In this case, the kind where the ships are taken in hand by a shipyard for a rebuild. This is the kind that crops up when a ship has to be kept in service, even after she is obsolescent or outright obsolete. Here is where you modernize the ship and give her some TLC so she can continue serving on. With this kind of partial modernization being very common during the 1920s and 1930s, the period where the various treaties made building new ships rather problematic, at least capital ships. Because of this, you see this refit a lot with battleships. American ones, for example, saw minor rebuilds during the interwar period. They would go in for a bit and come out with new superstructure and secondary guns, along with new boilers and turbines, though I should put new in air quotes here. Those were often taken from the canceled South Dakotas. Across the Atlantic, on the other hand, you had the less modernized ships of the Queen Elizabeth class, Barham and Malaya, or the more modernized Revenges like Royal Oak. They weren't rebuilt like QE herself or Valiant, but they were modernized to some extent. A similar story came with Japan and the modernizations of the Fusos or Isseis, which were certainly visually distinctive with the massive oversized pagodas, but in the end, still relatively minor compared to other ships in the same navy. In any event, the minor rebuild style of refit was also common for more cash-strapped navies. Your South American countries or smaller European powers such as Greece. They would modernize ships as best they could, but often the money wasn't there for a proper rebuild. This was true in the interwar years, but also in the Cold War and beyond. If you want a comparison to something more familiar, you could look to various Cold War tanks. Slap some ERA and modern sensors on, and bam, you have a modernized tank. Maybe toss in an upgraded engine for good measure. That would result in a tank of dubious utility in some cases, but it's a pretty common thing, even in larger militaries. One need only look to the conflict in Ukraine. Regardless, once you move beyond this stage, you get into more extensive territory. On the still relatively minor end, you have the initial refits to the Renowns, where they don't change much on the exterior, but were actually pretty heavily modified, notably by increasing the armor protection. Both the main belt and the deck armor were improved, along with new torpedo bulges. It's not as extensive as Renown's later rebuild, but it was still more than other interwar overhauls. Meanwhile, over in the land of the rising sun, you had the Congos. Modernized to the point, the Japanese called them fast battleships, once all was said and done. This work mostly consisted of improving the speed while modernizing the superstructure, the obligatory pagoda mast. The ships also got their sterns lengthened in order to increase their speed. Actual armor changes were pretty minor and certainly nothing akin to what was done on the Renowns, mostly revolving around reaching a uniform thickness of 8 inches on the main belt, although the deck armor was much more heavily improved, reaching almost 5 inches at its thickest. Regardless, this was still relatively tame, nothing like the truly extensive rebuilds that came around the same time. No, for that, you go to Italy. It's here where you get into the truly massive work, where the Italians took pre-World War I dreadnoughts and turned them into something completely new. Their armor remained thin by battleship standards at 250 millimeters or 9.8 inches, and their speed was still relatively slow, 27 knots at best, though this was a massive increase from the old 21 knots. Meanwhile, the guns remained the same old weapons, but bored out to 12.6 inches, 320 millimeters, from their previous 12 inches, or 305 millimeters. This came at the cost of the amidships gun turret, along with the original secondary battery. The former was removed to provide space for new, more powerful boilers, while the latter was replaced by new turreted secondary guns. The bridge superstructure was also replaced by something more closely resembling Italian cruisers, at least on the Cavours. On Andrea Doria, it more closely resembled Littorio. Even all this work was still nothing on the hull itself. On the Dorias, the ships received an entirely new bow. The old one was chopped off and replaced by a longer and sleeker affair. On the Cavours, the new bow was quite literally grafted on top of the old one. Needless to say, these ships came out looking and performing nothing like they did when they went in. These were still small, light, and arguably outmoded ships, but the technical triumph of these rebuilds cannot be understated. The Italians took small, slow, pre-World War I battleships and turned them into relatively fast and effective warships for the 1940s, though they remain less effective than truly modern battleships, and a common argument is made that they remained worse than their direct competition. Meanwhile, a bit later on, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, you saw almost as extensive rebuilds for the American standards. Those damaged in the attack were pulled from the bottom and given pretty extensive work. How extensive varied on the ship, with West Virginia certainly receiving the most work. She came out as almost a new ship between the hull and superstructure changes, along with an entirely revamped secondary battery, while the British pretty heavily rebuilt Renown and likely would have done the same to Hood had she not been sunk. Even the Soviets rebuilt their old battleships as much as they could. Not quite to Italian levels, of course, but comparatively speaking, it was a major effort. Still, I think the most wacky of all rebuilds belongs to an unlikely owner, the Ottoman Empire, where money for the Navy was always tight and they kept ships in service long beyond their sell-by date, where getting new ships sometimes took the early 20th century equivalent to a GoFundMe. Here we find the central battery ironclad Mesudiye. She was one of the largest and most powerful ships in the Ottoman fleet upon her completion back in 1875. Powerfully armed with 12 10-inch guns and heavily armored with 12 inches of armor plate. This ironclad would serve for about 30 years in the Ottoman fleet, by which point she was very outdated. And most of that service was more accurately spent rotting by the dockside due to chronic lack of funding. Again, the Ottomans were rather poor and had difficulty with replacing ships with more modern vessels. So, here you have a very outdated, but relatively large, if admittedly slow, warship, in a navy that really needed more modern ships in the time of rapid advancement that was the late 19th and early 20th century. So, this is where a plan came about to modernize the old Ottoman ironclads. Among other things, it involved rebuilding Mesudiye from a blocky, sail-rigged ironclad into what resembles, externally at least, a pre-dreadnought. A small one, but a pre-dreadnought nevertheless. Complete with a proper superstructure and 2 turrets, one on the bow and stern, with 9-inch guns, as well as replacing the 10-inch muzzle loaders with breech-loading 150mm guns. Her boilers and power plant were refit as well, to the point the ship could, theoretically, make 17 or so knots. Not bad for a refit of an ironclad. Which, yeah, it was impressive. But most sources state she never got the 9-inch guns and used mock-ups instead. She was a bit of a paper tiger, though in the confines of the Aegean, I suppose that 12 5.9-inch guns was nothing to sneeze at. And with that particularly wacky rebuild out of the way, we come to the end of this video. There's plenty of other examples out there, of course, but for now this suffices, along with my existing wacky conversion video. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.